February 18, 1945, 13:47 hours, 12 miles inside Germany. Captain Thomas Weber stood at the edge of a frozen field, holding a white flag he had fashioned from a torn bedsheet taken from a farmhouse. He was about to do something that went against everything West Point had taught him: surrender without firing a shot. Behind the German defensive lines, 100 American prisoners of war were lined up in 2 rows, strategically positioned to take the first bullets if Weber's company attacked. An hour earlier, a German lieutenant had delivered the commander's message under a white flag: "Attack our position, and we will execute all prisoners before your first shell lands. Lay down your weapons and everyone lives." Weber had spent that hour doing the math, and it made him feel sick. His company numbered 150 men infantry, some armored support capable of taking the fortified German position through a coordinated assault. The Germans, however, held defensible ground with approximately 80 soldiers, machine gun emplacements, and clear firing lanes. A well-executed attack could succeed, but the cost would be high, estimated 50 to 60 Americans killed or wounded. The Germans had placed 100 American POWs directly in the line of fire prisoners captured during a breakthrough the previous week, specifically used as human shields. The situation was simple and grotesque. Attack. 100 hostages executed before the first American soldier even reached the German lines, plus 50 to 60 casualties from the assault itself. That would bring the total death toll to between 150 to 160 Americans. Surrender. 0 immediate casualties, but 250 Americans would become prisoners. All would remain alive, assuming liberation eventually came, and assuming the Germans honored the surrender, if this wasn't a trap to execute them all. Weber had contacted his battalion commander for guidance. Colonel Morrison's reply was clear: "You're a West Point officer. You know the code. Commanders do not surrender. Find another way." Then the radio went silent. Whether due to equipment failure or deliberate disconnection, Weber would never find out. He was alone, with 150 men under his command, 100 hostages behind enemy lines, and a white flag that went against everything he had been trained to believe about military honor. This is the story of a surrender that saved 250 lives, but destroyed one man's career. It's the story of the captain who chose humanity over the honor code and spent the rest of his life being punished for keeping everyone alive. The story of the white flag that appeared as cowardice from every angle, except the one that mattered: the men who walked away breathing. Before we continue, if you believe that some acts of courage require abandoning everything you've been trained to value, hit that subscribe button. This is the story where surrender saved more lives than fighting ever could, and where the army convicted the man who made that choice. Weber walked across the frozen field alone, the white flag raised, feeling the weight of 150 men watching him commit the ultimate betrayal of military tradition. The German defensive position was 400 yards ahead, close enough to see individual soldiers, far enough that retreat would be impossible once he crossed the halfway point. Behind him, his company waited in the tree line, weapons at the ready, but not aimed. They understood what their commander was about to do, yet they were powerless to stop him. The German commander, Hauptmann Dieter Richter, emerged from the defensive position to meet Weber at the center of the field. 2 officers, facing each other across 4 years of war, one holding a white flag, the other holding the lives of 100 hostages. "You are surrendering?" Richter asked, his English tinged with a German accent. "Under the condition that all prisoners, the 100 you're holding and the 150 I'm bringing, are treated according to the Geneva Convention. No executions, no reprisals." Richter scrutinized Weber closely. "Do you understand what this means? A West Point officer surrendering without resistance? I understand that 250 Americans will be alive at the end of the day. That's what matters. Your army will call you a coward. My army isn't standing where I'm standing." Weber lowered the white flag. "Do we have an agreement?" Richter nodded slowly. "You have honor, Captain Weber. A strange honor that chooses shame over glory, but honor nonetheless." He motioned toward the defensive position. "Tell your men to approach with weapons lowered. No resistance. The prisoners behind our lines will not be harmed." Weber turned and signaled his company. 150 American soldiers emerged from the tree line, walking across open ground toward the German positions, their weapons pointed down, surrendering without firing a single shot. The 100 hostages watched from behind German lines as their rescuers became prisoners alongside them. 0 casualties. 250 Americans alive. One captain's career destroyed before the surrender was even complete. 3 days later, advancing American forces liberated the position. The Germans had retreated, leaving 250 American POWs alive and unharmed, exactly as Richter had promised. But before the Liberation Force had even finished processing the prisoners, Weber was placed under arrest. The charge was filed within 6 hours. Cowardice in the face of the enemy surrendering command without resistance. Thomas Weber had saved every man under his command and every hostage behind enemy lines. And yet, the United States Army was preparing to court-martial him for it. Thomas Weber graduated from West Point in June 1938, ranked 6th in his class, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant with the belief that military service was the highest calling a man could answer. His father, Colonel James Weber, had graduated from West Point in 1914, served in France during World War I, and died at Belleau Wood in June 1918, refusing to surrender his position despite a German assault. Thomas grew up hearing the story how his father had held his ground against overwhelming odds, ignored retreat orders, and fought until German bullets took his life at his post. The family legend was clear. Weber men don't surrender. They die first. Thomas attended West Point because it was family tradition, because his father's name was engraved on memorial walls, and because military honor was a legacy passed down as more valuable than money or property. The academy reinforced everything his father's legacy had taught him. Officers lead from the front. Officers accept responsibility. Officers die before dishonoring their command. The West Point honor code was explicit. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. Beneath that written code, however, lived the unwritten one. Commanders never surrender while they still have the strength to fight. Weber's training emphasized the concept of death before dishonor, in such a way that surrender was literally unthinkable. Case studies of officers who'd surrendered were presented as cautionary tales, men who had chosen survival over duty, preservation over honor, and shame over death. Instructors taught that a commander who surrendered betrayed not just his men, but every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. Surrender was seen as a contagion. If commanders could yield when circumstances grew difficult, entire armies could become negotiable. Weber internalized this completely. By the time he graduated, he believed surrender was worse than death, not just metaphorically, but literally. It was better to die fighting than live with the shame of having yielded. This wasn't merely academy indoctrination. It was part of his family legacy, his father's sacrifice, and the very foundation of the identity Thomas had built his life around. He deployed to North Africa in 1942, where he commanded a platoon in Tunisia and earned the Silver Star for holding his position against a panzer attack. The citation read, "Refused to retreat despite overwhelming enemy force, maintained defensive line, prevented German breakthrough." Weber kept that citation next to his father's posthumous medal, 2 generations of Weber men who had chosen death over retreat. In Italy, 1943, Weber commanded a company at Salerno, holding the beachhead against a German counterattack, earning the Bronze Star. Again, the citation emphasized his steadfastness. Maintained position under intense fire, refused withdrawal, secured critical terrain. Weber's reputation grew, the captain who never gave ground, never retreated, and embodied West Point values to their core. By 1944, Weber was considered the model officer. Battalion commanders cited him in leadership training. Captain Weber represents everything we want in commanders: courage, determination, refusal to accept defeat. His personnel file had no record of hesitation, retreat, or any sign that he might be willing to yield. Thomas Weber fought forward or held his position. Those were the only two tactical options he recognized. He married Grace in 1940, with a brief honeymoon before his deployment. She had grown up in a military family and understood that being an officer meant long absences and the possibility of telegrams announcing death. Grace knew the story of Thomas's father, understood the pressure that weighed on him. She once told him, "Come home alive. That matters more than medals." Thomas had smiled and said nothing, because West Point had trained him to believe that honor mattered more than survival, and he couldn't explain that to someone who loved him. By February 1945, Thomas Weber had commanded for 3 years without retreating, yielding, or even considering surrender as a tactical option. He had internalized his father's sacrifice as the template for his own career. Die before dishonor, hold before retreat, fight until victory, or until bullets made the decision for him. Then, on February 18, 1945, he stood at the edge of a frozen field, holding a white flag fashioned from a bedsheet, preparing to violate everything his father had died for, everything West Point had taught him, everything his career had been built to avoid. 100 hostages behind German lines changed the equation. It didn't change his training that said to attack regardless, accept casualties, and maintain honor. But it did change the mathematics of what honor meant when measured in lives. Weber had spent his entire life believing that surrender was unthinkable. Now, he was walking across the frozen field with a white flag raised, prepared to be called a coward, if that's what keeping 250 men alive required. His father had died rather than surrender. Thomas Weber was about to surrender to save lives. The family legacy was about to be buried under the shame that Weber was choosing deliberately. The 100 American hostages behind German lines had been captured on February 11th, 7 days before Weber faced his fateful decision. They were remnants of 3 different companies caught during a German counteroffensive supply convoys ambushed, infantry patrols surrounded, artillery observation posts overrun. It was the typical chaos of fluid combat. The Germans rounded up the survivors, marched them 12 miles behind their lines, and held them at a defensive position that became critical terrain when the American advance reached the area. Hauptmann Dieter Richter commanded the German Position 80 men, a fortified farmhouse complex, and excellent defensive ground. Richter was a career Wehrmacht officer, 43 years old, a veteran of Poland, France, and Russia. He had learned through 4 years of retreat that delaying the American advance required creativity. A standard defense would hold at best 6 hours before American armor and artillery overwhelmed his position. But American prisoners changed the mathematics entirely. Richter positioned the 100 POWs in 2 rows, 50 yards behind his main defensive line, close enough that any American artillery would hit the prisoners first, visible enough that the American assault force would see them before attacking. Human shields deployed with surgical precision. The message was clear: attack us, and your own men die before they even reach our guns. On February 17th, Richter sent a lieutenant under a white flag to deliver terms to the approaching American forces. The lieutenant found Captain Weber's company positioned for an assault. preparing the standard combined arms attack. He delivered Richter's message: "We hold 100 American prisoners positioned in your line of fire. If you attack, we will execute them before your first shell lands. If you surrender without resistance, all prisoners, yours and mine, will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have 24 hours to decide." Weber spent the next 24 hours calculating every possible scenario, searching desperately for a tactical solution that didn't involve either a suicide assault or a shameful surrender. He examined every option. Flanking maneuver. Impossible. The German position was backed against a river, with the sides protected by marsh terrain. The only approach was across an open field directly through the hostage position. Artillery preparation. This would kill the hostages before it even touched the German defensive line. Richter had positioned them perfectly to absorb the first shells. Sniper elimination of guards. The Germans held the hostages in open ground with minimal guards. Even if Weber's snipers killed every visible German, the others would execute the prisoners before any rescue could reach them. Night infiltration. February nights were clear, with a bright moon, and the frozen ground amplified every sound. Any infiltration attempt would be detected before reaching the hostages, triggering immediate execution. Negotiation for prisoner exchange. Weber's company had no German prisoners to trade. There was nothing to negotiate with, requesting armor or air support. This would take at least 36 hours. Richter's deadline was 24 hours, and even if armor or air support arrived, it would still face the same problem. Hostages positioned in such a way that any attack would kill them first. Wait for Richter to retreat. The Germans weren't going to retreat. The position was too valuable. They would hold it with hostages as protection until the American advance forced a different tactical situation, which could take days or weeks. Every scenario Weber calculated ended the same way. An assault would result in 100 dead hostages, plus 50 to 60 casualties from the attack itself. The hostages would die first. That was mathematically certain. Richter had positioned them to guarantee that. Weber radioed his battalion for guidance. Colonel Morrison's response reflected the institutional mindset. Commanders don't negotiate with hostage-takers. Find a tactical solution. You are authorized to accept casualties if necessary to take the objective. Sir, casualties include 100 hostages executed before we reach the German lines. Regrettable, but potentially unavoidable in a combat situation. Your primary obligation is mission success, not hostage preservation. Mission success costs 150 American lives, sir. That's combat mathematics, Captain. You have orders to take that position. How you do it is your tactical decision, but surrender is not authorized under any circumstances. Weber understood what Morrison was implying without saying it directly. Attack and accept the massacre, or somehow find a miracle solution that didn't exist. But don't surrender, because institutional honor mattered more than the body count. Weber spent the morning of February 18th reviewing his calculations over and over, hoping the mathematics would change. They didn't. Every scenario ended with approximately 150 dead Americans hostages executed, assault casualties accumulated, the blood price paid for upholding the honor code that insisted commanders never surrender. Then he considered a different scenario: surrender without resistance. Casualties, 0. All 250 Americans would become POWs, all alive when liberation came. Assuming the Germans honored the terms, assuming liberation came within a reasonable time frame, assuming it wasn't an execution trap. Even with the worst-case assumptions for surrender, fewer lives would be lost than in the best-case scenario for the assault. The mathematics were clear. The honor code said attack. The mathematics said surrender. His father's legacy said die rather than yield. 250 living men said yield rather than let anyone die. At 13:47 hours on February 18th, Weber fashioned a white flag from a bedsheet and walked across the frozen field, carrying the most shameful object a West Point officer could hold. He was choosing mathematics over honor, 250 lives over military tradition, breathing men over dead heroes. West Point had trained him that this choice was unthinkable. Thomas Weber was thinking it anyway. Thomas Weber crossed that frozen field, feeling his father's disappointment with every step. 400 yards from the tree line to the German position, the white flag held high, walking alone across open ground where attacking would have meant sending 150 men to their deaths. Behind him, his company watched their commander commit what they knew to be an unforgivable act. Ahead, German soldiers watched an American captain surrender without firing a single shot. Hauptmann Richter met him at the center of the field, exactly as they had arranged. Two officers, standing in no man's land, negotiating terms that military doctrine insisted should never be negotiated. Richter was older than Weber had expected, 43, with a weathered face and eyes that had witnessed 4 years of retreat across Europe. Not a fanatic, just a professional soldier trying to survive a war Germany was losing. "You have decided," Richter said. It was a statement, not a question. "My men will approach with weapons lowered. No resistance. You will treat all prisoners, the 100 you're holding, and the 150 I'm surrendering, according to the Geneva Convention. No executions. No reprisals." Richter nodded. "You have my word as an officer. All prisoners will be held safely until this position is overrun, which will happen soon." He paused. "You understand what you are sacrificing?" "My career. My honor. Everything West Point taught me to value." "For what?" 250 men who'll be alive tomorrow." Richter studied him carefully. "In Russia, I saw German officers order suicidal attacks rather than accept the shame of surrender. Thousands died for their commander's honor. You are choosing differently. I'm choosing my men over my reputation. Your army will not see it that way." "I know." Weber turned toward his company, raising his arm in the signal he had arranged. The gesture felt like betrayal, not of his men, but of every officer who had died, rather than make this choice. "They're coming now." 150 American soldiers emerged from the tree line. They walked in formation, despite the surrender, a final vestige of discipline maintained even in defeat. Weapons held low, not aimed, pointing at the frozen ground. Sergeants kept the formation tight, maintaining order in surrender as they had in combat. The company crossed the field silently, the only sound the crunching of boots on frozen mud. Weber watched their faces as they passed him, some relieved, some ashamed, others confused about whether their commander had saved them or betrayed them. Sergeant Morrison met Weber's eyes briefly. Morrison had served under him since North Africa, had watched Weber earn 2 medals for refusing to retreat. Now, Morrison was surrendering without a fight, because Weber had ordered it. Morrison's expression was unreadable gratitude or contempt. Weber couldn't tell. The German soldiers accepted the surrender with professional efficiency. They collected weapons, searched the prisoners for contraband, and directed them toward the farmhouse complex where the 100 hostages waited. There was no violence, no celebration, just the practical processing of POWs by soldiers who understood that this was temporary American forces would reach this position within days. Weber was processed with his men. Stripped of his sidearm, his personal items catalogued, he was marched to the holding area where the hostages had been kept. The hostages recognized his uniform and realized what had happened. Captain Thomas Weber had surrendered 150 additional men to prevent their execution. 100 lives saved at the cost of 150 additional prisoners, and Weber's career. The 3 days as POWs were surreal. The Germans treated them correctly, adequate food, shelter in a barn, no abuse beyond the fact of imprisonment itself. Richter kept his word completely. He even spoke with Weber briefly on the second day. American forces are 2 kilometers away. Tomorrow or the next day this position will be overrun. You and your men will go home. I will probably go to a prisoner camp. Both of us made choices for survival rather than glory. On February 21, 1945, American armor overran the position at dawn. The Germans retreated after brief resistance, leaving 250 American POWs unharmed. The Liberation Force processed the prisoners efficiently, medical checks, casualty reports, unit identification. Captain Weber reported to the liberating battalion commander, Major Phillips, expecting relief or gratitude. Instead, Phillips' first words were, "Captain Weber, you're under arrest pending court-martial. The charge is cowardice in the face of the enemy surrendering your command without resistance." Weber stood at attention. "Sir, I saved 250 American lives by surrendering without firing a shot. That's cowardice, Captain. You'll have the opportunity to explain yourself at court-martial." Phillips gestured to the MPs. "Take him into custody." 250 liberated Americans watched as their rescuer was arrested, the captain who had surrendered to save them. Weber was placed in handcuffs before the liberation was even complete, before the freed hostages could thank him, before his company could explain to investigators that surrender had been the only option to prevent a massacre. Thomas Weber had kept every man alive. The United States Army was now prosecuting him for choosing life over honor. The court-martial convened on March 8, 1945, in a requisitioned German schoolhouse 20 miles behind American lines. 3 officers presided: Colonel Hartman, Major Pierce, and Captain Sullivan. The prosecution was Captain Anderson, the same JAG officer who had convicted Nathan Cross, Tommy Reeves, Bobby Mitchell, and James Hendricks. Anderson had built his career prosecuting soldiers who achieved results through unauthorized methods. Weber's case was his most straightforward yet. A commander who had surrendered without resistance. The charge was explicit: cowardice in the face of the enemy. Captain Thomas Weber, commanding officer of Company B, 2nd Battalion, surrendered his entire command to enemy forces without engaging in combat, without exhausting tactical alternatives, and without authorization from superior command. Anderson's opening statement was brief. The facts are undisputed. Captain Weber faced a German position holding hostages. Rather than attack, he surrendered 150 men without firing a single shot. This is textbook cowardice, surrendering when you still have the capacity to fight. The law is clear. The code is clear. Commanders who surrender without resistance betray every soldier who has ever fought. Weber's defense counsel was Major Richard Hayes, assigned reluctantly. He knew conviction was certain, but he was required to mount a defense nonetheless. Hayes called witnesses methodically. The freed hostages testified first. Sergeant Parker, captured on February 11th, said, "The Germans told us they'd execute all 100 of us if the Americans attacked. Captain Weber surrendered to prevent that. He saved our lives." Corporal Matthews added, "We were lined up as human shields. Any assault would have killed us first. Weber chose our lives over his honor." Private Coleman remarked, "I watched Captain Weber walk across that field with the white flag. The bravest thing I ever saw, knowing his career was over, but doing it anyway to keep us alive." Anderson cross-examined without sympathy. "You're grateful Captain Weber saved you, but gratitude doesn't change the fact that he surrendered without resistance. Would you want to serve under a commander who surrenders when circumstances are difficult?" Weber's own men testified next. Sergeant Morrison, who had served under Weber since North Africa, said, "Captain calculated every tactical option. Every scenario ended with approximately 150 Americans dead, hostages executed, assault casualties. Surrender was the only option that kept everyone alive. Lieutenant Davis spoke next. I was prepared to attack if Captain ordered it, but I understood his reasoning. We'd have killed our own men trying to rescue them. Anderson reframed their testimony. These men followed orders to surrender. They had no choice. But Captain Weber had a choice, to fight or yield. He chose to yield. That's the definition of cowardice. Hayes then presented Weber's tactical analysis, every scenario examined, every calculation showing that an assault would result in a massacre. My client made a tactical decision based on the mathematical certainty that fighting would kill more Americans than surrendering. Tactical decision? Anderson's voice was sharp. Commanders don't get to decide when surrender is tactical. Surrender is failure, period. If we allow commanders to surrender because they calculate that casualties are too high, every difficult fight becomes negotiable. Military discipline collapses. The court turned to Weber directly. Did Colonel Morrison authorize your surrender? No, sir. He ordered me to find a tactical solution. He said surrender was not authorized. But you surrendered anyway? Yes, sir. Because every tactical solution ended with approximately 150 dead Americans. Surrender ended with 0 casualties. So you substituted your judgment for your superior's orders? Weber paused, understanding the trap. Yes, sir. I decided 250 living prisoners was better than 150 corpses. That's not your decision to make, Captain. Chain of command exists for reasons. The prosecution's closing statement was devastating. This court must decide whether commanders can surrender when they deem casualties too high. If we acquit Captain Weber, we tell every officer that surrender is acceptable when fighting seems too costly. This destroys military discipline. Weber saved lives. No one disputes that. But he did so by committing cowardice. Results don't authorize violations. Hayes's closing was desperate. 250 Americans are alive because my client chose mercy over honor. Conviction sends the message that honor matters more than lives. The court deliberated for 3 hours. Colonel Hartman finally read the verdict. Captain Thomas Weber, guilty of cowardice in the face of the enemy. Sentence: dishonorable discharge from the United States Army. Forfeiture of all rank and privileges. Weber stood motionless as the 250 men whose lives he'd saved watched from the gallery, knowing the Army had just declared that their survival was worth less than one captain's compliance with the honor code. Thomas Weber was dishonorably discharged on March 15, 1945, stripped of rank and uniform at the age of 30. West Point graduate, decorated combat veteran, 2 medals for courage. None of it mattered after the word coward entered his service record. The dishonorable discharge meant no veterans' benefits, no use of his military education, and no employment requiring security clearance. Everything he had built since 1938 was erased by one white flag that had kept 250 men alive. Grace met him at the train station when he returned to their apartment in Arlington. She had received his letter explaining the court-martial verdict, but not the full story. Weber told her everything: the hostages, the mathematics, the surrender, the trial. When he finished, Grace asked just one question. Did you save them? Yes. All 250. Then you did the right thing. She never questioned his decision again, never made him feel the shame the Army insisted he should carry. Grace understood what West Point couldn't, that her husband had come home alive by choosing other men's lives over his own honor. But Grace's acceptance didn't solve the practical problem. Weber couldn't work anywhere that checked military records. The dishonorable discharge appeared on every background check, marking him as morally unfit. Companies didn't ask why. They just saw the discharge type and moved on to the next applicant. Weber found work in construction. Manual labor, no background checks required, pay that barely covered rent. He was 30 years old, with a West Point engineering degree, combat leadership experience, and a tactical mind that had calculated surrender as the only option. He spent the next 43 years carrying lumber, pouring concrete, and doing work that required none of the skills the Army had trained him to use. The 250 men Weber had saved didn't forget. They wrote letters to the War Department, to congressmen, to military review boards. Sergeant Morrison organized a petition in 1947, signed by 187 survivors. Captain Weber saved our lives by surrendering without resistance. His conviction for cowardice is unjust. We request that his discharge be upgraded to honorable. The petition was reviewed and denied. The response came back. Captain Weber's court-martial was conducted according to proper procedure. The verdict was legally sound. Upgrade requests require new evidence of error. Survivor gratitude is not evidence of legal error. Weber never joined veterans' organizations, never attended reunions, and never wore anything that identified him as a former officer. He'd spent 7 years in uniform earning honor, only to lose it all in 3 days by choosing mercy. The mathematics still made sense. 0 casualties was better than 150 casualties. But mathematics couldn't change the fact that every man who saw dishonorable discharge on his record assumed he'd been convicted of something shameful rather than something merciful. Grace died in 1981 from cancer. Weber was 66, living alone in the same Arlington apartment they'd rented in 1940. He worked in construction until 1983, when back problems forced his retirement at age 68. Social Security barely covered his rent. He lived quietly, anonymously, just another old man whose significance had ended decades earlier. He died on February 18, 1988, exactly 43 years after surrendering to save 250 lives. A heart attack, at age 73, alone in his apartment. His obituary in the Arlington newspaper read, Thomas Weber, 73, construction worker, veteran, no immediate survivors. The obituary didn't mention West Point, medals, command, or the surrender that saved more lives than most officers ever protect. It definitely didn't mention that he'd been court-martialed for cowardice. In 1995, German military archives were declassified. Researchers discovered Hauptmann Richter's operational orders, dated February 17, 1945. American prisoners are positioned as human shields. If the enemy attacks, execute all prisoners immediately before their forces reach our defensive line. No exceptions. The orders proved Weber's calculation had been correct. Any American attack would have triggered the immediate execution of 100 hostages. Surrender had been the only tactical option that prevented a massacre. American military historians published their findings in 1997. Captain Weber's surrender was a tactically sound decision that prevented the guaranteed execution of hostages. His court-martial conviction, while legally proper under 1945 standards, failed to account for hostage crisis realities. The 250 survivors, now in their 70s, petitioned again in 1998 for a posthumous upgrade of Weber's discharge. They requested official recognition that his surrender had saved their lives. They asked for acknowledgement that the cowardice charge was unjust. The petition was denied. The official response came, Captain Weber's conviction was legally sound based on the evidence and military law of that era. While subsequent evidence supports his tactical judgment, the legal proceedings were proper. A posthumous upgrade would require proof of procedural error, not proof of tactical correctness. If this story makes you question whether honor codes that punish mercy are worth preserving, subscribe, because Thomas Weber surrendered to save 250 lives, spent 43 years being punished for choosing humanity over tradition, and died before the army admitted his mathematics had been right all along. The 250 men he saved lived full lives, raised families, and died naturally, knowing the captain who'd surrendered had saved them. Thomas Weber, on the other hand, lived in shame, worked construction, and died in obscurity. The officer who calculated that lives mattered more than honor and was convicted for it. His grave in Arlington National Cemetery has no military marker, no mention of rank, and no recognition of service. Just Thomas Weber, 1915–1988. The Army never forgave him for the surrender that kept everyone alive. 250 families exist because one captain chose the white flag over glory. The system called it cowardice. The survivors called it courage. And 43 years later, German archives proved Weber had been right. But legally, that didn't matter.